I walked through a cemetery to meet a stranger. The field of tombstones had cascading levels of care. The ones closer to the entrance gate were well taken care of. The grass mowed around them, a clear layout of where the residents were placed below the ceramic angels and fabric rose petals of plastic stems. The further I looked out, the more obscure the grave markers became, peeking out from under fallen branches and some reaching for sunlight beneath little ponds of groundwater. It was clear that this was the right cemetery and that the elder parts were further back from the road, under a cropping of unkempt trees with wild branches. My shoes were filled with cold water as my steps away from my car were becoming buried in the moat that had naturally formed around the small group of trees. It was as if nature itself were protecting this burial site. It reminded me of the efforts that Egyptians went through to ensure that the bodies of their most respected leaders were protected from outsiders. This was like an American Deep South version of that. The ground tilted further down before rising up in an oval shape where the trees crowded around a monument that must be 10 or 12 feet tall. There was an iron fence that reached just below my knees, and I stepped over and walked to the monolithic concrete structure. Thanks to a little help from the internet, I had located the rendezvous point with the stranger, his name written proudly and straight across this concrete monument, Wiley Jones. I wanted to see for myself where this legend had found a final resting place. I had been researching his story and trying to piece it together for months with the help of experts of Black history. Wiley's story was one that is hard to imagine living, yet it was real and still influences the way of life in Pine Bluff to this day. This is a man who was bigger than life and by all rights should have had several movies based on his life, but unfortunately time isn't kind to Black stories from the Jim Crow era. You can't pull a book from the shelf to read his story or pull up any lengthy documentary. There are a couple of various wiki pages online, but not much more than that. I came to the cemetery to tell Wiley Jones that I was going to do my best to tell his story, how he was a man born into slavery, thrown into war, became an entrepreneur, and gave his community more than they had ever had. Finances, infrastructure, politics, and maybe more importantly, respect. He was a servant, a mule driver, a plantation manager, a barber, a banker, a horse racer, a transportation mogul, a businessman, a wealth bringer, and a catalyst for a new way of life despite the Jim Crow South. Lincoln made laws to free Black slaves, but Wiley Jones gave them freedom. In 2022, I met Brian Rogers at an event supporting nonprofit organizations. He was hosting a booth for the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center. I made my awkward way of introducing myself by skipping past the small talk like, "Hey, how are you? And what do you think of this event?" And instead, I just asked, what was the Mosaic Templar Cultural Center? I had heard the name a few times, and I'd seen their building, but always assumed by the name that it was just a church. Brian was kind enough to set me straight and told me how they were an organization that honors African American history. Words are important, and it stuck out to me that he said honored instead of preserved or recorded. It felt like more than just performing an action, but to have it mean something to you. I introduced myself as Ty King from the Arkansas Podcast Collaborative and told him about the kind of work that we do. He said that he had always wanted to do a podcast on a man named Wiley Jones. I had never heard this name before, but we had a few meetings after that to find out what this podcast idea could become, and Brian had a lot of experience on Wiley's story. He had written a college dissertation on him. This story had me hooked the more I thought about it. What must it have been like to always be a part of two opposite worlds but not belonging to either? To put your head up and your feet solidly on the ground to build something this state had never seen before, and making a way for future leaders, all the while the threat of lynchings in sundown towns always were right behind you. Why is it that the massively important story of Wiley Jones would never be in history textbooks in school? In less than 2 weeks of meeting Brian, I was set up in his office with a single light, a camera, microphone, and lots of questions.
My name is Brian Rogers, and I am the Adult Education Interpretive Specialist at the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center. I am also a historian here at Mosaic Templars Cultural Center. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in history from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. And it was there, while working on my master's degree, that I came across a Arkansas resident named Wiley Jones. Wiley Jones was born in Morgan County, Georgia in 1848. He was the son of a white planter named George Jones and one of Georgia's enslaved women named Anne.
To elaborate what life was like for Wiley and Black people at this time in history, I reached out to several Black history experts. Dr. Najee K. Baptist is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Arkansas. He specializes in Black politics, social movements, and political behavior.
So, as you said, he's born into slavery. And to be born into enslavement and chattel slavery means that you're born subhuman. That means you are constantly reminded that you're less than. So then the question has to be answered, what was so unique about Willie Jones, or was this unique about Willie Jones, that he had this ultimate level of empowerment that we see that even now in 2024, we're talking about a man who died in 1904, right? You talking about 120 years since he's hit the ground, right? But I think somebody like Willie Jones is the epitome of what we saw, right? From 1848 to 1868, he is the child of a mother who was the result of a coercive rape, right? His mother was a slave owned by George Jones, and Anne, who we don't even have her last name, right? This is how subhuman you know. I think when people think about the psychology of enslavement and kind of what it means for like Pine Bluff in its early development, which is probably rural.
Throughout American history, we've heard of these relationships between slave owners and their enslaved. And because of the vast difference in power, these women who were oftentimes simply used as property by slave owners, by overseers, by other white men who lived on the plantation. These women had no chance, no choice, but to acquiesce to the sexual advances of the white men in their sphere.
Dr. Kelly Houston Jones is the last person I would have thought of as a Black history expert. A young white woman who could fit into anywhere USA. Her resume proved me absolutely wrong. Dr. Jones is an assistant professor of history at Arkansas Tech. She specializes in American slavery, particularly right in the heartland of where Wiley was born and lived, and has been published in several books, including some of her own. Google was on my side this time and had led me straight to one of the most knowledgeable people on the planet for what I was studying.
It's very common to find that an enslaved woman has children with her enslaver. And the thing to remember is that it's impossible for someone who's held as chattel to provide the level of consent to any kind of interaction that we would expect today. So although in these types of connections, there may have been some level of affection or bond, of course we don't know that, but even in those cases, what we expect today is not possible. So for that reason, many scholars would count all of those types of connections as rape because consent is just not possible. Free consent is not possible. That power differential is always there. So one thing that we find is that enslaved women might use the fact that their enslaver thinks of them as desirable to their advantage. And so it might be a type of arrangement where enslaved women at some level move forward with the belief that their children may experience greater care, safety, because of this connection. And that I'm trying to be really careful about that because I wouldn't ever want to certainly not repeated, as someone saying that, oh, they loved each other and they obviously if they had all these babies, but we don't know. We just simply don't know. But yes, it was a common thing. And the worldview that these patriarchs in the system that they have is that that's part of what they're entitled to. Everyone under them, their wives, their children, free servants, enslaved servants, all of those people are dependents in their worldview. And so they have access to those folks' labor and they have sexual access to anybody under them in that hierarchy. Sometimes what you're seeing is the son of a plantation family deciding to relocate with a financial start, from their parents. And so they'll come out to places like Arkansas to get that started. And so they're benefiting from that generational wealth that comes from being a slaveholder. And that's true for the plantation class, and it's also true for the more humble sort, what we call the yeoman families who are coming out to Arkansas. So there's a benefit of that sort of boost that they get as being in the slaveholding class, which is a pretty elite class to be in. But they're also, if they can get in there as a slaveholder, the prices are increasing so rapidly and so reliably that the money that they can make over time helps them to reinvest. And it's so cold and crude and calculating, but they'll be able to reinvest the money that they're making from just the natural increase of the enslaved population and grow those holdings. One thing that we know from the census data is that somebody who's holding 3 or 4 enslaved people at about 1840 will very likely be holding 10 or so enslaved people by 1850. And that is, to put it crudely as they would, it's an incredible return on their investment as far as the increase. Without doing much else, they're seeing an increase in the value of their property, not to mention the work they put into the acreage, or that they're having enslaved people put into the acreage. Barns, fencing, cleared fields, all of that kind of stuff makes their acreage more valuable, and then they can expand the parts of that acreage that's in cultivation, so they can make more money. So a long way of saying, once someone gets into the slaveholding class, they are pretty sure of increased success. And so that's the aspiration for folks. And we think a lot about the plantation class. Certainly they're the leaders of this, but smaller slaveholders, which is the bulk of the number of enslavers in Arkansas, maybe 1 to 3 folks that they're holding in slavery. That's still pretty wealthy, and that's a very secure way to for these folks to invest the money that they have. So it's just sort of perpetuating all the time. Arkansas was the place where Arkansas and East Texas. These were the regions where slavery in the western cotton sections, the cotton frontier of the South, was growing the fastest. So when he arrives in Arkansas as a child, he's coming to a part of the slavery landscape that's transforming the most quickly. So the population is lower, it's more scattered than in other parts of the Cotton South, but it's growing the fastest. And the only place where slavery was growing faster between 1850 and 1860 than Arkansas was East Texas, like some parts of East Texas. So his family is arriving in a quickly transforming part, sort of fringes of the Cotton South.
By 1853, young Wiley Jones arrives in Jefferson County with his mother, his brothers and sisters, his father, and the other enslaved people that were owned by George Jones. They settle on a plantation, the Bird Plantation, about 12 miles north of the city of Pine Bluff. And Bird was the former acting governor of Arkansas.
The Bird Plantation that Dr. Rogers refers to was owned by former acting governor of Arkansas, Richard Byrd. It was located in Jefferson County, 12 miles north of Pine Bluff on the Arkansas River. He had temporarily taken the governor's position after the previous governor, Thomas S. Drew, resigned because the salary of a governor at that time wasn't enough to keep up with his financial needs, especially after investing in railroad speculation, which was not a very profitable bet at the time. Byrd sat in the position for 3 months before deciding that he would rather go home and run his mercantile store.
They lived on that plantation. And a few years after arriving in Arkansas, George Jones dies. Upon his death, Anne expected to be freed along with her children. Apparently, at some point, George Jones had told Anne that upon his death, that she and their children would be freed. However, the manumission papers were never found. And when George Jones's estate was sold, the children were sold with the estate.
If he did promise it, my question is, where's the paper, right? But again, he could have promised it in a more disingenuous way of saying, okay, yeah, I promise I'm gonna free you, right? I mean, think about it. Jones is married to probably a white woman because he can't be married to a black woman. He's raping this woman. And then how do I keep this woman under my control? How do I keep Anne under my control? I have to offer her false promises. Yeah, baby, listen. This is what I'm saying. One day I'm gonna free y'all and my kids. Just stick with, because regardless, you gotta understand, more than the manuscripts or the document of freeing was the inherent desire to be free. And enslaved Africans would make a run for it. Right? And so this slave owner who falls in love with this item called Anne, and Anne is thinking, he don't love me. He doesn't want to be with me. He don't care about his children. I'm going away. You know what I mean? We're going to figure out how to get off this plane. And so this is a form of coercive control. This is a method on which you keep, he may have authored it, he may not. You know what I mean? But, traditionally when a slave owner offers someone's freedom, it's usually with the paperwork in hand, because they know that these slave owners knows the society in which they live, of this white supremacy and patriarchal world in which they live. They know this, right? They know how their friends operate. So they, if anything, he would have made sure there was an ironclad contract, because only at the time could white men even execute documents of that sort. And so, was this promise made? Yes. Did the document ever be officially executed? Who knows, right? I think it was just a false promise to keep Anne and her children, 6 children, under his thumb, right? And then, or maybe he meant it and then died before he could get it done. Who knows? But what we do know is, because he did not take an affirmative action to get this done, his children and his mistress and sex slave was put back into enslavement. Wasn't even allowed out of it. Put back to was not even allowed out of it, right? And so you don't know who your children are going to next. You don't know who this person that you claim to have some sort of affinity towards is going to next. They could have easily been killed as soon as they got sold off. It's just you're leaving it up to chance. You're leaving people. It's almost playing like Russian roulette with Black people's lives.
Dr. Sharice Jones Branch is the Dean of Liberal Arts and Communication at Arkansas State University. She has won multiple awards for her studies on rural history.
Promising to liberate folks, giving them property, providing them with education. That's not an uncommon story either. One of the dangers that comes along with that, though, is what if this person has what would be considered a legitimate white family, right? And then that family says, well, you can't have this. We're the legitimate family. We're actually entitled to it. And in which case, manumission papers might disappear and lands might not be passed to whomever they're supposed to go to. So no, those are not uncommon stories at all. And again, that speaks to the complexity of these relationships and the history of slavery throughout the South. These things happen. People did attempt to pass on property and freedom and whatever to children they had with enslaved black women. And sometimes they did so successfully, and sometimes, and probably more often than not, they didn't.
It would be a wise strategy for someone to sort of dangle something like that. There were many enslavers who would provide promises to help keep folks in line. And so it might have been easier for this slaveholder to keep Wiley Jones's mother in the system that he's got set up, for them domestically, to promise freedom. I could see how he would employ promises like that to try to stamp out any resistance to the situation. That would maybe have her thinking that compliance could, ensure the safety, of her children. Now, about where the papers went, that's one of the benefits that these folks enjoy, is that they can be pretty sure that the folks they're holding in slavery aren't going to be able to read or write. Arkansas law did not prohibit that, but the convention was that it was frowned upon to teach enslaved people to read and or write. And so it may be that the papers disappeared. It may be that they never existed, and this was something to just try to ensure compliance with the situation. Even if the papers had existed and were found, the chances that that would have been enforced by that time in Arkansas, the mood is not friendly to that kind of situation. So even if those papers did exist, it would have been unlikely that they would have been enforced. I have seen cases where a will has been thrown out, a will that promised freedom, was thrown out by descendant, heirs, people who stand to lose financially over this. So, and those justices it's easy to convince them that some document wasn't official, or, that kind of thing. So it's a sad and common story.
The administrator of the estate sold the family to Peter Finnerty before he would sell to General James Yell.
Wiley Jones, along with his brothers and sister, were sold to General James Yale, who was the brother of former Arkansas Governor Archibald Yale,
a prominent attorney and planter in Pine Bluff. On the Yale plantation, 10-year-old Jones drove the mules to the cotton gin. James Yale was born in the chill of a Tennessee March in 1811, and he carried the legacy of his uncle, Archibald, who'd shape Arkansas. He learned the law, taught school, and married Permelia Young, fathering 2 children, but the pull of Arkansas led him to Pine Bluff in 1838. There, James Yale practiced law, served in the state senate, and pursued political ambitions, running for governor as a Whig American, a party that had formed in opposition to the tyrant president that they referred to as King Andrew Jackson. Jackson had been using his veto power more than all the previous presidents combined, and many people saw it as an abuse of power. He's responsible for the Indian Removal Act, an order that resulted in the Trail of Tears. Jackson was considered to have destroyed the National Republican Party with what he called the spoils system. This was an exchange where political supporters were given government positions. If you backed up Jackson, you were rewarded with political power. This is going to be important to Wiley later in life. Yet the nation's brewing crisis consumed James Yale. He became a fervent supporter of secession, aligning with Governor Rector, eager to pull Arkansas from the Union. At the secession convention, Yale's voice joined the chorus of those pushing Arkansas into the Confederacy. The fractured nation and choices made in that moment forever defined his legacy, a man of Tennessee roots caught in the tempest of a divided South.
And so during that time, young Wiley Jones did what lots of young enslaved boys did. They tended to the household animals. They acted as a body man for one of the enslavers' children, or in Wiley's case, he drove a wagon. When Wiley turned 10, he was given as a wedding gift to James Yale's son, Fountain Pitts Yale. And this would have been 1858, 1859. So somewhere around there, and tensions are rising in that period as the country marches towards the inevitable Civil War.
Fountain Pitts Yale was about 14 years older than Wiley. Even to be in his early 20s, he was well accomplished. He practiced law in Pine Bluff. He married and served as state representative for a year. Wiley served as the carriage driver for Fountain's wife, Martha.
After someone dies and they're liquidating estates or passing estates on or whatever, where human beings are described right along with mules and cows and horses, right? It's almost as if they are in fact not considered human. Right. But what we do know is that they are human, that they exhibit humanity. So in telling these stories and in the way people are telling stories about slavery and the enslaved now, we're seeing far more clearly the very human side of that experience rather than just talking about these folks as commodities.
In 1861, Fountain Pitts Yale had followed his father's footsteps, became an attorney, a political representative, a slave owner, but with all this unrest going around the country, he decided to take action and signed up to join the Confederate Army. He was going to war, and he was taking Wiley with him. This limited podcast series is produced by the Arkansas Podcast Collaborative, a nonprofit organization with the mission to advance diverse podcast programming starting in its home state of Arkansas. This podcast is produced, written, edited, and narrated by Ty King. This podcast was made possible by the Curtis H. Sykes Memorial Grant, supporting projects that preserve, commemorate, and enhance the heritage of African Americans in Arkansas. Funding is administered by the Black History Commission of Arkansas and funded by the Arkansas General Assembly through the Arkansas State Archives. If you want to hear the entire epic tale of Wiley Jones, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and watch the video format on YouTube. You can find links to all of the platforms on our website at arkansaspodcasters.org/Wiley Jones.